Have you ever noticed how the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest histories? There's a generation moving through life right now, steady, capable, almost eerily self-sufficient. Not because they were born that way, but because they had to be. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. Zeno walks into every room already prepared for disappointment, already 3 steps ahead, already asking nothing from anyone. Not out of coldness, out of survival. And here's what the noise around boomers and millennials keeps drowning out. Generation X may be the most psychologically complex, deeply feeling, and profoundly misunderstood generation alive today. And it's time we finally understood why. And to understand Zeno, to truly understand this generation, you have to go back to an empty house. Picture a child, 8 years old, turning a key in a front door lock. No voice calling from the kitchen, no smell of dinner on the stove, just silence, and the quiet hum of a television clicked on for company. This was the daily reality for millions of Gen X children, the first generation of latchkey kids on a massive scale. By 1984, research published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry documented approximately 7 million children between ages 5 and 13 regularly coming home to unsupervised afternoons. Not occasionally, routinely. But here is what we rarely pause to feel about that statistic. Behind every number was a sensitive little heart, learning one of the most defining lessons of its life, that you cannot always count on someone being there. And when you are a child whose nervous system is still forming, still reaching outward for safety and connection, that lesson doesn't just teach independence. It carves itself into the architecture of who you become. Psychologists describe this kind of environment as a high contingency setting, a world where actions and outcomes are directly, immediately linked, with very little emotional buffering in between. Zeno learned, young and quietly, that consequences were real, that adults were sometimes absent, and that the safest person to rely on was yourself. And so Gen X built something remarkable inside themselves, a deep, almost instinctive competence, a calm in crisis that younger generations often find baffling. But here is the tender truth that research asks us to sit with, that self-sufficiency, as admirable as it looks from the outside, was never really a choice. It was an adaptation, a beautifully constructed emotional shelter built by children who simply had no other option. And shelters, no matter how strong, are built because something outside felt unsafe. When the parents of Zeno finally came home, there was rarely space for feelings. Discipline was swift. Emotional conversations were uncommon. You learned where the lines were by crossing them and paying the price immediately. There was no soft landing, no careful explanation of why, just consequence, and the quiet instruction to move forward. And so they did. Forward, always forward. Self-reliant, emotionally armored, and already, at 8 years old, learning to need no one. Zeno did not become guarded overnight. The armor was built slowly, layer by careful layer, by a world that kept proving it could not be fully trusted. Gen X grew up watching the adults around them make grand promises about stability and then quietly break them. Divorce rates climbed steadily through the 1970s and 80s. Fathers who had given decades of loyal service to corporations came home one afternoon with pink slips and hollow eyes. The message the culture sent to children was clear and consistent. Work hard, follow the rules, and life will reward you. But Zeno watched closely, and what they saw was that the rules changed without warning, that loyalty was rarely returned, and that the ground beneath stable-looking lives could shift without notice. Psychologists call the response to this kind of repeated disappointment defensive pessimism, a cognitive strategy where the mind anticipates negative outcomes not out of despair, but as a form of emotional protection. For Zeno, it simply felt like being realistic, like keeping your expectations honest so that when something fell apart, and something always eventually fell apart, you were not destroyed by it. This is also why Gen X developed such a complex, almost allergic relationship with visibility. They grew up in a world where privacy was simply normal. When you stumbled as a child, and every child stumbles, perhaps a handful of people witnessed it, and then life moved on. There were no cameras, no viral moments, no permanent digital record of your most awkward, vulnerable human instance. And so the nervous system of Zeno learned early that visibility carries risk. that the less the world could see of you, the safer you remained. This is not technophobia. This is deeply rational emotional wisdom, grown from genuine experience. And because the weight of the Cold War hung over their entire childhood, teachers conducting nuclear drills with an eerie matter-of-factness, adults simultaneously alarmed and dismissive, Zeno learned something extraordinarily sophisticated: how to hold two contradictory realities at once, how to laugh at the darkness without pretending it isn't there. Irony became not cynicism, but a shield, a way of staying present in an overwhelming world without being consumed by it. The armor was never coldness. It was always, at its quiet core, a form of profound sensitivity, learning to protect itself. What the world rarely sees when it looks at Zeno is the extraordinary richness living beneath that composed, self-contained surface. Because while Gen X never asked for recognition, they built something remarkable, a work ethic forged not in theory, but in the real, physical, unglamorous world of early morning paper routes, fast food registers, and bicycle chains repaired with grease-covered hands. These were not resume builders. They were initiations, early, honest introductions to what it actually means to be responsible for something beyond yourself. Cognitive psychologists describe the kind of learning that comes from genuine effort as deeper encoding. Information and skills absorbed through real struggle become more permanently integrated into who we are. Zeno didn't just learn tasks, they internalized capability itself. And here is where something genuinely beautiful emerges from all that difficulty. Despite being shaped by absence and self-reliance, Gen X became quietly, fiercely collaborative. Not in loud, visible ways, not with social media posts announcing their generosity, but in the steady, dependable way of someone who shows up when it matters, helps without fanfare, and asks for nothing afterward. Research in the Journal of Adult Development confirms that Gen Xers report lower levels of seeking social support during stress, not from lack of connection, but because asking for help was never modeled as safe or acceptable. And yet, they give it freely. Their relationship with authority carries this same beautiful complexity. Zeno does not follow titles. They follow competence. If you have earned your position through genuine skill, through real knowledge and demonstrated care, they will be among the most loyal people in any room. But hollow authority, leadership built on status rather than substance, receives from them a quiet, immovable skepticism born from watching incompetent figures make devastating decisions throughout their entire formative years. And now, Zeno watches their own children grow up in a world of constant supervision, digital documentation, and hovering parental attention. They gave their children what they never had: presence, visibility, protection. And yet sometimes, quietly, they wonder, have we softened something that needed a little roughness to grow strong? Because in the deep, well-worn wisdom of Generation X, invisibility was never a wound. It was, in its own complicated way, the very thing that made them who they are, feeling deeply, moving quietly, and carrying more than anyone ever fully sees. And perhaps that is the most quietly profound thing about Zeno, not the independence, not the resilience, but the fact that beneath all that carefully constructed calm lives a generation that felt everything and simply learned to carry it alone. Generation X was never broken by the world. They were shaped by it in ways that deserve to be seen, understood, and deeply honored. If something in these words finally made you feel recognized, please subscribe and share this with someone who has always carried more than they ever said. And maybe that is the most beautiful truth about Zeno. They never needed the world to notice them, but they deserved to be understood all along. If these words finally gave language to something you have always quietly felt, subscribe and share this with someone who carries more than they ever say.